What do you get when you combine Armored Core, Virtual On, and Zone of Enders? Well, maybe something like Garrison Archangel. I'd say that's the closest comparison, but at the same time, it's really not. On paper, you've got the customization of Armored Core and the sleek, fast-paced combat of Virtual On and Zone of Enders, but in practice, only in the barest sense. Garrison Archangel is fun, with a fair amount of reward for those who stick with it. However, it's held back by an incredibly short playtime and poor balancing that keeps it from ever reaching the heights of the games it's trying to emulate, which is a shame as modern mech games are few and far between. Garrison Archangel exists in a strange middle ground, not exactly old, but not new either, at least at the time of me recording this. The game saw its full release in May 2020, right at the onset of that pandemic, following 3 years in early access. And yet, despite all that time in development, it now sits abandoned by its creators, Indigo Gaming, the last update coinciding with its full release. Now, this game isn't a new experience for me. Back when I first started this channel, when my videos were barely 3 or 4 minutes long, I picked this up on the cheap, hoping to cover it. I remember staying up an entire night to complete it, playing in bed on a laptop that was practically molten by the time I was done. But as luck would have it, none of the footage recorded and I ended up shelving the game until now. Honestly, I didn't think much of it at the time. Though, digging into its history, it's clear that Garrison Archangel started with a lot of traction online. Many recognize the years of effort that its developers, Indigo Gaming, were pouring into the project, bolstered by how active they were with their player base. Indigo frequently engaged with feedback, fine-tuning the game's mechanics in response. They even hosted 2 tournaments dubbed Cosmic Clash to gather data specifically on the combat system.
Overloaded, I will beat you.
Oh, here we go.
Oh, here we go. Uh-oh. And Josiah being the first one to bow out of this trade.
The winning mech configurations, Blitz, Airmaster, and Crystal Star Queen, were added to the game as part of its official roster. For a moment, Garrison Archangel genuinely seemed like it could break through to a larger audience. Videos showcasing its fast-paced mecha combat racked up tens of thousands of views on YouTube. Articles and blogs highlighted its customization depth and gameplay potential, fueling excitement in niche gaming circles. Early discussions on Reddit even mentioned the game catching on in Japan, where it was frequently streamed by VTubers, further boosting its appeal. Years after its May 2020 release, the game still made waves in 2022, being recognized as one of the top 10 games from the Philippines by the Game Development World Championship, an organization that, while niche, continues to spotlight indie titles from around the world. On Steam, Garrison Archangel maintains a solid reputation with an 82% positive review score despite its relatively modest pool of feedback. Today, the game's player base has dwindled, with active players often numbering around 20 at any given time. Yet, despite its decline in popularity, this very small but dedicated community continues to engage with the game. It's a testament to the enduring appeal of Garrison Archangel, a game that lets players kit out their mechs and dive into seemingly high-energy duels. Looking into its numbers, I found some stats through, and I'm going to butcher this, gameelect.com. While I can't verify their accuracy, it's reported that Indigo sold over 9,000 copies of the game, generating nearly $120,000 in sales. That might sound decent for an indie game, but development costs quickly add up. Garrison Archangel was clearly a passion project, and I'm sure that a lot of that revenue went right back into keeping it afloat. Still, something doesn't quite add up. For a game that seemed to have as much traction as it did, garnering tournament interest, significant press coverage, and a cult following, you'd expect more than 9,000 copies sold, or the mere 204 reviews on Steam. On the platform, the game holds an 82% positive rating from this relatively small pool of feedback, which, while solid, doesn't quite reflect the buzz it once generated. Then there's the most glaring question: why did Indigo Gaming seemingly abandon the game altogether? Their website no longer exists, and they haven't developed anything else under that name since. Even stranger is the continued activity on the Garrison Archangel Twitter/X page, with posts as recent as this year. Whoever's behind it is still out there, though their focus has shifted entirely. Instead of continuing down the path Garrison Archangel started, they've opted to repost general mech-related content. Interestingly, I've noticed several promotions and mentions of a game called Mecha Blitz by Tactile Studios, which makes me wonder if some of the former Indigo Gaming developers are involved. Of course, that's just speculation on my part. Now, the game's abandoned status largely stems from its multiplayer mode, which remains stuck in a beta state. And honestly, I feel that this was a major misfire. Garrison Archangel launched during a time when nearly everyone was stuck at home, desperately seeking online games to fill the void. An unfinished multiplayer feature at a moment like that, it likely crippled the game's potential to stand out. That's not to say the multiplayer doesn't exist, it does, but it's limited to peer-to-peer or local play. Unfortunately, this wasn't what the game's community was asking for. They wanted global lobbies to battle other players online, share their custom Archangel configurations, and flex their designs in real time, not share codes. It's a missed opportunity and one that could have driven a streaming boom, especially during the peak of the pandemic. Garrison Archangel may have retained a far higher player base than 20 active users at any given time, if so. This limitation on multiplayer options likely being a blow to the potential for a larger audience. Thankfully though, I'm more of a single player kind of guy, so this didn't bother me much. To be fair, even if the multiplayer had been fully realized, I doubt it would see that much use today. Even flagship mech titles like Armored Core 6 struggle to maintain consistent multiplayer populations over time. And for what it's worth, I do wish Armored Core 6 had a more active multiplayer scene, but that's a tangent for another time. Back to Garrison Archangel, there is plenty to keep you busy outside of multiplayer. Modes like Mission Mode, It's New Game Plus, Arcade Mode, and Horde Mode are available. I've spent a decent chunk of time exploring these, admittedly drawn in by how quick and satisfying the gameplay loop is. It's perfect for someone like me who doesn't have the energy or frankly the time to grind through a 20+ hour or so campaign. If you're lucky enough to own a Steam Deck or something similar, I argue this game is an ideal fit. Its pick up and play style works so well for handheld gaming. That said, part of this feeling might be because it resembles a mobile game at times. There's a simplicity to its design that makes it easy to jump into, but the downside is that this simplicity can start to work against it the more time you spend with the game. It doesn't have the predatory gacha mechanics or pay-to-win nonsense you'd expect from a mobile title, which is refreshing. Still, its lack of depth in certain areas becomes more apparent the longer you stick with it. To put it simply, the major draw of Garrison Archangel is its customization. The game lets you design your own bipedal humanoid mech, perfectly tailored to whatever power fantasy you want to live out in the game's maps and missions. And when I say there's a lot of customization, I'm not exaggerating. Even after multiple playthroughs, you'll still find yourself unlocking new pieces, skins, and upgrades, so long as you align yourself with different factions and corporations each time. If you've ever wanted to build an extremely mobile mech that rains down firepower with rapid-fire weaponry, you can. Prefer to nuke your enemies from orbit? That's on the table too. Or if you're like me and you want to rock a pair of melee weapons, whether it's giant swords, katanas, or scimitars, guess what? You can do that as well. Everything in the game is upgradable, and many pieces come with special skin unlocks to further customize your build. It's genuinely impressive how much effort went into offering players such a huge variety of options. So if you're here for that and solely that, you're really going to enjoy what Garrison Archangel is. However, there is a noticeable imbalance with many other aspects of the game. None of it lives up to the options on display, and I go so far as to say that by trying to provide so much, Garrison Archangel accomplishes almost nothing in terms of story and gameplay. As the saying goes, a jack of all trades is a master of none. By attempting to combine the gameplay and feel of all its influences, Garrison Archangel instead manages to highlight their flaws, while introducing some new ones of its own. There's a clear effort to emulate the corporate-run world and player choices seen in Armored Core, and to its credit, the variety here is even greater. But by expanding this aspect so much, the game loses its sense of direction, especially in its mission mode. You can align yourself with multiple factions over the course of a single playthrough, which typically lasts just an hour or two. The consequences of betrayal are shallow and easy to undo, and it's often more rewarding to exploit the system, collecting benefits from one faction before switching sides. Sometimes betrayal even feels advantageous, triggering random encounters with invading Archangels. Defeating these enemies unlocks their configurations for use in other modes, which is undeniably fun if you're not too interested in story or progression. And that's fine, if the narrative isn't your focus, there's plenty to enjoy here. However, the game clearly wants to suggest that rivalries, motives, and agendas exist among these factions and corporations. The problem is that you never feel their weight. There's no real sense that your actions matter or that you're shaping this world in any meaningful way. It's only at the end of a playthrough, when you receive one of the faction-specific endings, that it feels like anything you did might have carried significance. Until that point, it's all surface level, which can be disappointing for those hoping for a more impactful or immersive experience. Now, what complicates this further is the inclusion of a neutral or bad ending, which you unlock through a prolonged skirmish with aliens that appear if you do not choose to align with a faction for the final mission during the last handful of turns the mission mode allows. This twist comes completely out of nowhere, as the aliens aren't an active faction within the game. Their presence is limited to occasional random encounters with green-colored enemies, so their sudden importance feels very jarring. That said, this alien invasion scenario does fit the overall tone of the game's loose, open-ended narrative. It reflects the indecisiveness of your actions and lack thereof over the course of a playthrough. In a way, it does make the most sense thematically speaking, but because it isn't set up in any meaningful way throughout the game, it feels less like a consequence of your choices and more like a last-minute curveball. The game's implementation of arena-style combat, reminiscent of Virtual On, results in a series of small, tight, and often repetitive skirmishes within confined areas. That's not to say these skirmishes are all the game has to offer. There is more variety here, which I'll get to in a bit, but the overall design leans heavily on this structure. In fact, much of the time, Garrison Archangel feels like it's leaning more towards being a fighting game than a mission-based experience. Because of this, the combat encounters with minor enemies tend to lack depth. These enemies pose almost no challenge, as they don't interact with the player's moveset as dynamically or intelligently as Archangels do. Instead, their reaction times are sluggish and their AI is downright pitiful at times. This leads to a lot of missions where very little thought or effort is required. Often you just zip towards the target, mash the shoulder buttons, or click the mouse, and the mission is over in less than a minute. It really feels like the game was built to shine in one-to-one Archangel battles, but the majority of its missions fail to capitalize on that strength, making many encounters feel more like filler than meaningful gameplay. This likely explains why enemy factions often drop Archangels randomly into missions, a feature that I'll admit is undeniably unique. However, given the short length of nearly every mission, with the exception of certain Final Faction missions, you'll often complete the objective before these rivals even have a chance to reach you. And when they do show up, you might find it's actually more entertaining to take them on than actually focus on the mission at hand. Most missions revolve around basic tasks, defeating a set number of enemies, surviving waves, or capturing a point by standing in one area. While there are 2 or 3 larger maps, the brevity of most missions lets the developers drop players into random locations to create the illusion of variety. But the longer you stick with the game, the more these cracks begin to show. The missions that deviate from this formula are mostly arena-style battles, sometimes in the form of tournaments, other times as bounty hunter missions. These fights feel like the heart of the game, whether intentionally or not. Here, the combat doesn't always feel meaningless, but I'd argue that at least 90% of Archangel fights still end incredibly fast and boil down to mashing a button or clicking the mouse repeatedly. Yes, the game offers additional fire modes and parts that unlock a variety of alternate weaponry and special moves, but these mechanics only really shine during the 10% of fights that demand a bit more strategy. Or alternatively in the arcade mode, which is structured more like a traditional tiered fighting game. In those moments, you get a glimpse of what Garrison Archangel could have been if it leaned harder into its strengths, though that would have required a far more complex and balanced combat system than what the game ultimately ended up with. The biggest issue though is the glaring compensations made to deal with the game's utterly broken camera. When you aren't locked onto a target, the camera actively fights you, resisting any attempt to control it. In my experience, it's quite literally the worst camera I've ever encountered thus far in a game. To make up for this, the developers included an auto lock-on system by default that essentially plays the game for you. Seriously, in most situations, all you need to do is lock onto a target and button mash. That's it. Unless you're in one of those rare encounters that requires a little thought or strategy, you're essentially doing what you do in a Moso game. But unlike those games, Garrison Archangel doesn't have the content or sheer chaotic spectacle to make that approach feel rewarding. Instead, you're left with very small, bite-sized missions that, while convenient for short bursts of gameplay, lack the substance to hold your attention when you actually have time to invest. It's frustrating because the simplicity works when you just want a quick play session, but it leaves so much to be desired when you're hoping for more depth. No game should leave you questioning what exactly you've been playing after several short playthroughs, yet that's where Garrison Archangel often finds itself, satisfying in small doses but ultimately hollow when the dust settles. To me, it's an absolute shame. Garrison Archangel looks great and the customization is genuinely fun. Nothing about me wants to dislike this game, and I don't. I had some fun with it initially and I completed the game several times. However, in doing so, I just couldn't avoid noticing its flaws. The gameplay, at its core, boils down to simple button mashing. Lock onto an enemy, and then either fire away or smash them into oblivion. Occasionally, equipment like shields or certain setups can be useful, especially in the rare Archangel fights that present an actual challenge, but most of the time it's 1 or 2 hours of repetitive button mashing until the mission is complete. In fact, during one playthrough, I had to stop because my hand cramped from the repetitive motions. When I switched to mouse and keyboard, the game became even easier, and it became painfully clear just how little I was actually doing. That said, there was a fanbase behind this game leading up to its release, and a very small one still exists to this day. Likely, these fans are those who really enjoyed the customization and didn't mind the extremely simplified combat. In a way, it's no different from fans of gacha or mobile-style games. In fact, Garrison Archangel probably would have fared much better as a mobile game or even on the Switch. There was clear international interest in this game, but unfortunately, the sales didn't match the views, and it's hard to imagine that $120,000 in revenue over 3 years came close to covering the time, effort, and expenses Indigo poured into the game. Dropping the game entirely at its full release without investing in dedicated multiplayer servers was a huge missed opportunity. With the pandemic pushing so many players towards online gaming, Garrison Archangel could have held onto its fanbase a whole lot longer. Sales likely would have grown over time, probably better than the meager 9,000 to 10,000 copies it reportedly sold. At $14.99 on Steam, I'd say it's not an unreasonable price so long as you don't go in expecting too much. At the very least, you'll get to enjoy the excellent customization, which remains one of the game's strongest features. It's a game that had so much potential but ultimately fell short in some key areas. Still, for what it is, there's some fun to be had if you go in with tempered expectations. The customization, the style, and even the ambition of the developers are worth appreciating, even if the game didn't quite stick the landing. As always, thank you for watching. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Did you try Garrison Archangel, or did this video make you curious enough to give it a shot? Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell to stay up to date with my content. And if you'd like to support the channel, consider joining the community on Patreon or Discord. Until next time, take care, and I'll catch you in the next video.